Redditors who have been clinically dead, what did you experience in death, if anything? A quick content warning for this one in this thread. There are multiple mentions of death, some disturbing details and stuff like that. If for any reason you don't want to hear about any of that, it's all good. Here's your warning to click off the video that being said here we go. I coded after surgery. I remember being able to see and hear everything and understand what was happening, but I couldn't physically feel anything. It was deeply unsettling. Commenter. My heart also stopped after surgery 3 years ago. I only remember them getting me back and drifting between darkness and seeing the nurses panic. Like you mentioned, I felt nothing and was just an impartial observer. The aftermath was the worst. Realizing how close I was to oblivion and recalling the dissociation was horrifying. People often say, "Oh, I'm not worried. She's a fighter," when someone gets very ill. But me, I feel like I was just ready to watch myself fade into the dark, despite being content and having things to live for. Unsettling is exactly the right word. Commenté too. That was the weird part for me too. The impartiality. It's like the emotional part of my brain stopped working before the intellectual part did. I basically was just patiently waiting to find out whether I was going to be dead or not. I had no feeling about it at all at the time. The unsettled feeling came later. Story 2. My wife and I discussed this at length. 4 years ago, she died twice in 3 months, needing full resuscitation both times. Both were lengthy rescues. One resuscitation was off and on for nearly 40 minutes. I asked her later when she had recovered if she remembered anything at all during the time she was clinically dead. She remembered nothing. Blackness. No light. No relatives and former pets waiting for her. Just black. Thankfully, also no pain. She finally passed 18 months ago, and I hope she felt no pain or worry the final time. It started with 2 spontaneous brain bleeds. Technically, it started with her having lupus. The first brain bleed led to her passing, but they did a craniotomy, revived her, then a rebleed. The trauma from all that caused her lupus to set fire, which lead to complete kidney failure and another cardiac arrest, passing and recovery, which lead to 2 strokes. She recovered enough to be home and mostly independent, but having to go to dialysis 3 times a week for 3 years. She passed the final test to get on the kidney transplant list on Wednesday and had a massive cardiac respiratory event at dialysis on Friday where she passed again, but was kept alive on life support. I waited a week hoping for recovery, but we disconnected life support per her wishes, a topic we had talked about many times. Story 3. A friend of mine described death, she was technically dead twice, as being surrounded by darkness and floating with some sort of warm gel-like substance covering her. She never wanted to leave that state. Commenter. It's basically hypoxia. When you huff glue or nitrogen or whatever, you deprive your brain of oxygen. The sensation you would feel after your heart stop is your brain running out of oxygen, losing efficiency, and eventually shutting down. It turns out, most people feel happier with less of their brain working. Story 4. I died twice after I got Misrza into my heart area after a major surgery. I don't remember much of anything when I was out. Cliché as it was, I saw a light. But that year sucked. Story 5. When I was 15, I was scheduled to do a tilt table test. They lean you up at an angle on a table because I was consistently experiencing dizziness and fainting spells. After about 20 minutes, the doctor tilted the table back and I could feel myself passing out. I got severe tunnel vision and lost like 95% of my eyesight, like looking through a straw, and then I blacked out. I remember hearing the doctor call the code and my father cussing at the doctor that he killed me. I remember hearing a lot of slamming and banging around, which I assumed was the crash cart and nurses shoving into this small testing room. I felt a pressure on my chest, like when you have someone stand on your back to crack it, which I found out later was the nurses doing CPR. I saw an array of vivid colors kind of dancing around, forming objects in the dark. The scariest thing was how peaceful it felt. Just pure 100% peace. No panic, no pain, no sadness. Nothing, just bliss. I coded for just under 2 minutes, and as soon as I came to and opened my eyes, I felt seriously angry and hostile. I started ripping off whatever I could get my hands on and yelling at the Deaz to get me off the table. And forgetting to mention my heart stopped because I had an undiagnosed heart problem, Wolff Parkinson White, that caused my heart to more or less misfire. Story 6. Not mine, but the head of my program was in a horrible car accident. She was dead for a few minutes on the scene while paramedics worked on her. She said it was the most amazing feeling she's ever experienced. It was blank black, nothing, but that was perfectly fine. And she felt a comfort she can't even explain. She remembers being angry at the man working on her when she finally came back to her body because she wanted to stay there. She told us she can't wait to experience it again when it's really her turn. She's not religious in the slightest, and she actively quashes our ghost stories and crap, mortuary students, because she only believes in tangible things. So she fully turned me into a believer. Felt it's important I make a distinction she was very adamant about when telling us this story. She's not advocating died. She stressed that she isn't telling us she's trying to reach this place again, but that when it was her time, she was going to be comfortable embracing it. Story 7. Friend of mine described it as deeply relaxing and that she could feel herself drifting away, but was brought back just as she was ready to leave. After that, she embraced life and death. She said she doesn't fear death anymore since it was so relaxing to experience. Commentaire. Similar experience here. As you're dying, you start feeling tired in a way you never have before, or will again until you die. The sheer act of staying alive is exhausting. But then it's all blank until I woke up from a coma a couple weeks later. You don't even remember the actual moment of death, and it takes weeks for your mind to remember everything leading up to it. I was in a ton of pain before and after, because a couple of my organs were perforated, but dying itself wasn't painful. I agree that I'm also not afraid of death, not even just because of the pain factor, but because it feels less unknown to me, and there isn't time for regret when it happens. Story 8. I was electrocuted by about 13,800 volts. The doctors say it's likely the first hit stopped my heart and the second one started it, before I was pulled like a lifeless corpse to safety. I remember experiencing the darkest dark and the most silent silence. I ceased to care that I was dying. Time seemed to change. It could have been hours, it seemed. It was only about 30 seconds. I felt as though I was floating and floated towards something that I eventually realized was my body and reality. Upon joining with whatever it was I was floating towards, I became self-aware in my body and heard the electricity making horrible noises and knew I was in danger. From there, it was a horribly painful experience where I lost most of my toes due to tissue death. More surgeries than I care to count, and seeing the round bone ends of my toes that were freshly remoted still haunts me a little. I was in the hospital for about a month, inpatient, and then for 10 months, daily as an outpatient. Basically sent me home for my mental sanity, but needed daily attention. I got addicted to painkillers, had to learn to walk again, and had to see a pain management therapist. It was horrible at times, but eventually the pain began to subside. I went back to school and became an engineer, and I don't think I'd be where I am without this thing happening. Really strange to think that I'm in some way grateful now. Also, I can't watch horror anymore. Hollywood actually does a very realistic job. Story 9. My girlfriend is anaphylactic, and it is triggered by a chemical called salicylate, found in pretty much every food. When she was in high school, she had her first big reaction, and the school nurses refused to administer her EpiPen, adrenaline shot, until the ambulance got there. Now, obviously, having an anaphylactic reaction doesn't give you a lot of waiting time. So by the time the ambulance got to her school, she was in pretty bad shape and barely conscious. The paramedics immediately administered one of her EpiPens, called the nurses damn, and loaded her into the ambulance as her mother arrived. She continued to fade, so they gave her a direct injection of adrenaline this time. Still nothing. They give her a second direct injection of adrenaline, and this time it hits her about 30 seconds later all at once, and her heart fails. She stops breathing. No pulse. Nothing. Dead to the world. For about 2 minutes and 46 seconds, she was clinically dead. And the scariest thing is, she saw nothing. She tells me that when you are losing consciousness, you can't tell the difference between waves of drowsiness and when your body actually shuts down. All she saw was the darkness of her eyelids, and it felt like going into an extremely calm sleep where she couldn't hear or feel anything, and she didn't mind it, all despite the fact her mother and the paramedics were screaming at her to keep her eyes open and the ambulance was flying towards the hospital. She miraculously just came back to life almost 3 minutes later as they were giving her chest compressions, and the cardiologist that assessed her later stated that all the adrenaline in her body was enough to not only stop her heart, but to also restart it with the little help from the paramedic pumping it around. But still to this day, she can't differentiate falling asleep after a long day and dying. Story 10. As someone who lost his younger brother 4 months ago to psychosis-induced died after years of painful and miserable addiction and anxiety and depression, many of these comments give me more of a sense of peace that he just couldn't be here anymore and needed to go. I'll hope he felt okay in his final moments and wasn't in the constant pain he felt 24/7 here and in his mind. Story 11. I was dead for a very short period of time, like 30 seconds to a minute. There's a big misconception about it. It's not like sleeping at all. I'll try to explain. There's always a sort of white noise in the back of my mind. It quiets down when I sleep, but it's still there. I never noticed it before I died, but I do now. I don't want to romanticize death, but when I was out, it was like this perfect nothingness. And nothingness is so hard to imagine normally, but once you experience it, and they bring you back, part of you wishes you could have stayed. There's no positive feelings there, obviously, but it takes away everything bad too. All your stress, the nightmares, the troubles, all gone. Just nothing exists. It's beautiful in a way. I'm not bad at all and hope to live the rest of a long and happy life, but I'm very much looking forward to a lack of consciousness when I do eventually pass again. And I can honestly say I don't fear death anymore. Story 12. I know 3 people that have been clinically dead and have come back. What they described is something much different than what people are talking about here. They all said, if you paraphrase, that it feels as if you're passing out, Someone compared it to odding on whippets, nitrous oxide. A feeling of your conscience slowly getting focused into one point in the exact middle of your head, while your limbs lose feeling in a tingling, pleasant way, and then you lose consciousness. One girl said that when she came back into conscience, she was hallucinating because she had no idea what was going on, and that she started dreaming of something safe, i.e. her mother hugging her in a warm bed. Story 13. Former coworker of mine died during heart surgery. I think she was out for 90 seconds or close to it. She wasn't religious or anything. She said that she remembered being in the room and seeing her dead uncle and cousin standing at the far end of the room watching everything going on. She shared this information during an icebreaker. Give us a fun fact about yourself. She didn't remember seeing a light or anything, just seeing her dead relatives at the end of the room. Commenter, my mom died during surgery as well, although I'm not sure for how long she stayed dead. She's always been salty about the lack of white light and relatives. I was just kind of watching the room while this doctor beat on my chest and kept yelling at me to breathe you, breathe. So finally I was like, ducking fine, I'll breathe, Jesus. And then the next thing I knew, I was in the recovery room. Story 14? My father died recently this year, and these responses are helping me find some comfort that his last moments were peaceful. Story 15. Overdosed. Flatlined. Didn't see a thing. When they hit me with Narcan, I woke up really mad, ripping IVs out of my arms, cursing out the poor, amazing staff who saved my life. Good times. 6 years ago now with all that crap behind me, luckily. Commenter, this is my story exactly. Waking up just pissed as duck. I want to go back to sleep. I told the medics to duck off and going back to sleep and heard the scariest do not ducking go back to sleep, like he meant it with every fiber of his being. So terrifying. I didn't get to go back to sleep. So for the record, this was my first time use. I thought it was like Droog and you do an entire line. A matchstick head size is enough. I was extremely wrong. I wasn't addicted, didn't experience withdrawals. I did throw up once I got to the hospital, but I did go back to the Droog for a bit after because I felt like a part of me did actually die. The withdrawals I felt after that are way different. I'm clean now though, had a good year. The previous two were ducking tough though. Substances was my escape to feeling stuck in a profession that wasn't for me, and couldn't find happiness anywhere because I had graduated and left all my friends at school, moved back home and was unable to live a life I wanted to. Story 16. I saw my grandpa. We talked for a while and he said I could go back with him or stay. I looked down and saw myself in that hospital bed with my brother holding my hand. He felt it turn cold and I never saw him cry that way before. Went back into my body and felt more pain than I knew in my life. Been a year of recovery and I lost most of my memory, but I'm happy. Story 17. This happened well before my GF and I got together, but she intentionally overdosed and was clinically dead briefly at the hospital. She said she could see the doctors and her husband in the room from above. And then she found herself in a meadow with her first boyfriend, just talking like nothing had happened. Then she felt herself getting pulled out of there abruptly and suddenly sprang up with her eyes wide open and she was back to life. Story 18. Not really sure what happened and it still freaks me out to this day. May's daughter was 4 and developed pneumonia. Her breathing would stop in her sleep, so we took her into the emergency room. She was there for a total of 5 days. For the first 3 days, her health kept deteriorating. And on the 3rd day, my girlfriend got a call that her mother had collapsed and was taken to the hospital. She was without oxygen for 20 minutes and was declared brain dead. That night, my daughter woke up and asked about Grandma. No one had said anything to her or in the room with her. We asked her what did she mean. She told us that Grandma came to her in a dream and said, "It's not your time yet. I'll go for you." Immediately, the next day, she was almost 100% better. Story 19. I was dead for 6 minutes. I was laying on the gurney and I was getting colder. Somewhere my body started warming up and everything became really calm and peaceful. I was not longer in pain. All the noise from her just went away. It was really enjoyable. I was thinking about my daughter and I was remembering all the things we had done. Slowly, it was just black and nothing. There was no knowledge of anything. I explain it as it was like before I was born. Then the worst thing in the world is being revived. I started hearing loud noises. I felt this massive pain. Then there was the nastiest stench ever. The smell was like every dead animal had crawled in my nose. The smell was so bad I started vomiting. I remember the DARs turning me on my side and watching my vomit spray on a nurse. Dying was the most pleasant thing I have ever experienced, and being revived the worst. Story 20. I was 7 years old, and one day I got rushed to the hospital by my parents because they heard me breathing really loud and hard. The last thing I remembered were faces of the doctors and nurses above me while I was lying on my back. Then I flatlined. The weirdest, unexplainable thing happened then and there. I suddenly could see the whole scene as a spectator, like I was a floating spirit in that room. I could see myself getting revived, saw my mom crying and my dad comforting her. Then I saw a white entity shaped like my body, falling through the ceiling and slowly, like a leaf on the wind, falling down to eventually land inside my body. That's when that experience ended. I was put in a medically induced coma, and I woke up after some days. I don't remember. I had stuff plugged into me, an IV, red glowing elastic ring on my finger, etc. Anyway, I later mentioned to the doctors that I saw it all. I saw them using the defibrillators, my parents, etc. No one really believed me and told me that I was probably dreaming and biasing my memories due to watching TV, but I know what I saw. I don't really recall what was the exact cause of my hospitalization, but I know that it started with an asthma attack, alongside with a heart failure. My memories from that time are a mess, and I spent a lot of time in hospitals. And I've taken heart meds and steroids till I was in my mid-teens. Wish I remembered more, but I never really had it explained to me. I just went along with the doctors, my parents, and medicines. As for the defibrillators part some of you mentioned, I'm really confused right now. I could have sworn that I saw them preparing the defibrillators just after they did CPR on me for some time. Maybe they used them after I got my pulse back. Sorry if it all sounds like a mess. Maybe I was actually just hallucinating like some of you imply. I just recalled one thing. I remember that while I was in the spectator mode, I saw a nurse handing a paper to my mom for her to sign. I later asked her what did she sign that night, and she was like, "How do you know I signed anything? You were unconscious." It turned out it was some insurance stuff. Also, I have a heart defect since birth. I don't know the exact name, but it has to do with something in my heart not closing properly, which caused me insane stabbing pains in heart area once in a while. They're gone now, so I'm off meds. Story 21. I was on loads of morphine, so it's still really hazy, and the fact it happened almost 6 years ago doesn't help the memory, but I'll try to recollect, as accurately I can, what happened and what I experienced. I had appendicitis, and my foster parents at the time didn't take me to the hospital until almost 3 days after it had burst. I should have been dead well before they took me. Even the doctors called it a miracle. Well, I died while waiting for surgery. I had to wait for a pediatric surgeon to come in because no one else felt comfortable performing the surgery on a case this bad with a child this size. Jeets took me to the adult hospital, not the pediatrics, which was 40 minutes away. I was 14, 5'3", and weighed 75 pounds, soaking wet. So while I was waiting for the surgeon, I was in a room with me, the doctor, my 2 foster parents, and my grandmother, who was an RN. Like I said, I was really drugged up and couldn't really focus on much and couldn't really do anything. The monitor I was hooked up to would beep really loudly from time to time, and the intervals between beeps started to decrease rapidly. Turns out, I wasn't breathing. I was conscious for the most part. I just kept forgetting to breathe. Doctors had to keep nudging me so I wouldn't sleep. I just remember being pissed at this loud beeping that kept me from enjoying a nice slumber. The doctor had to step out for a second, and my grandmother assured him she could look after me for a second. Unfortunately for her, she was out of her mind with rage at my foster parents. She didn't hold anything back. My grandma is a sweet Mormon Utah without a rude bone in her body. Well, I heard quite a few duck yous, pieces of crap, etc. My point is, she didn't notice I had passed out until the monitor signaled I had flatlined. This is the bit where I died and is by far the most vivid part of the experience. I remember being capable of thought, but no thoughts were in my head. I can only describe it as being conscious of my spirit, but without a body for my thoughts to be processed in. I just kind of existed without feeling, thinking, or being anything. I was floating. Honestly, at the time, it was a great feeling. I don't remember any visions of people, family, places, or anything like that, but I felt something wrap around me and comfort me. Without talking, I was assured I was okay, that there was nothing to be worried about, and at that point, my thoughts returned. I knew at that moment, without knowing how long I'd be able to keep thinking, that I had to go back. I didn't want to, but knowing that the last thing I'd see before I left mortal life was these 2 pieces of human trash who had abused me, neglected me, and treated me like a stain that they didn't want to bother trying to clean up. That did it. I wanted to get back to my body, fix my ducking life so I could go back and live with my biological parents and feel loved again. In that moment, that's all I cared about. And then I sort of willed myself back. Doctors had tried to resuscitate me, but had failed. Everyone was shocked when I opened my eyes and seeing the tears in my grandma's eyes. After thinking she'd lost me, that did it. I fixed my life. I reinvented myself and threw out all my anger, depression, rage, and everything else that put me in Brent and Karen's home. Honestly, the only anger I felt, the burning hatred kind that makes you want to do anything possible to release it. In the last 5-ish years since I moved from their home is when I think about them and how they're still fostering youth in custody and probably pulling the same crap with those kids. I live about an hour away from where they are now, and I have to restrain myself from driving up there, kidnapping those kids and taking them to the authorities with an explanation of why. The only reason I haven't done that is because I've tried telling the authorities what kind of people they are. I guess the words of a juvenile duck-up don't stack up against the lies from people who have practiced this crap for years. Story 22. Not me personally, but my grandmother, after giving birth to my uncle, was clinically dead for a bit. She told me that she felt herself rising out of her body and she ended up in the top corner of the room with a view over her bed and the doctor. It was then that she willed herself back to her body and was alive again after looking through this thread. It seems as though this has happened to a lot of people. I always just thought she was a bit crazy, as this was the story she told me for her justification for believing that there is a God afterlife. But I guess there is truth in her story. Story 23. One of my old frat brothers was clinically dead for like 40 seconds because of X-Nax. He said that he saw himself floating above his body in the hospital room. He said that he could see doctors and nurses working on him and family in the room. He said he slowly floated above the hospital and towards a light. He said the most peaceful feeling he has ever experienced washed over him. This is a person who has done medma and sec in college. He said it's almost impossible to describe the feeling with our vocabulary. He said it feels like a weight was lifted off you. He said he saw some long-gone family in the light, but they told him it wasn't his time. He said he was angry because he felt so good, but floated back down to his body. I have no idea if he's telling the truth, but he is a trustworthy friend. He never used substances again. Story 24. Anaphylaxis. Wasn't breathing. I considered all the hallucinations I experienced likely due to hypoxic episode until I told my mom what I saw. A middle-aged man who wasn't in scrubs standing still at the end of my bed while all staff were running around and doing their business. I was having a non-verbal conversation with him and he was telling me to calm down, focus on breathing. He wore a tropical-style button-down shirt, one of those old-school newsboys hats, and had a very pleasant demeanor. Mom showed me a photo of my grandpa that I never had seen before, and it was the guy at the foot of my bed, and he died before I was even born. Story 25. A black void. Then waking up in the air surrounded by people running around like crazy. I was cold AF, but in reality just room temp. Had to add and say that it was relatively peaceful, like being wrapped in a big warm blanket. Story 26. I'm going to have to speak for my dad here. He passed away a few years back. I wrote this out while back actually, but maybe this will be a relevant place for it to be also. Dad was fearful in his last days. He had been to the hospital many times, and every single time he came close to death. What he remembered didn't reconcile with what most people report when having a near-death experience. He, in fact, had a lot of bad experiences. One in particular where he relived a day 3 times in a row where doctors sedated him, but he was still fully aware of what was happening to him. He could hear the conversations, feel the pain, feel the choking and suffocation. When I saw him the next day, he had tears in his eyes as he tried to communicate a question on how many days he was out. When I told him one day, he was confused, and it took him a while to wrap his head around it. He thought he went to hell, and this was his eternal punishment. He pondered for a long time on what he could have done to deserve that as a punishment. He did not ever want to be in the hospital. He hated them his whole life, and that experience made him hate hospitals even more. Dad's last trip via ambulance, he actually walked out to the ambulance, and it wasn't because of the usual shortness of breath, it was because of chest pains. I was sure this was going to be a short stay and he'd be back soon. During his last stay, he experienced more sedation, more hallucinations, and more disorientation. I went to visit him every single day to get an update on his status. One night in particular, they had trouble getting his heart rate down. It was steadily beating at about 160 and would calm to 120 or so before going back up to 160. It wasn't good for him. Then, the next time he was up, I walked in right around his dinner time. He couldn't wait to talk to me, but he could barely talk. It took all of his effort and energy, but he had some things to say. Dad, son, I know without a doubt that there is an afterlife. Me, really? Dad, nods me. How are you so sure? You've been seeing guns on the ceiling and all kinds of hallucinations. Dad, that wasn't me. I wasn't here. Me, you weren't here. Dad, I was there. Me. Okay, well, did you see anyone you knew? Dad, shaking his head. No, it's not like that. You can see souls being born into life, and it's the most beautiful thing you can see. Everyone has their own color, and they're trying to get to white. Me, trying to get to white? Dad, nods yes. Time doesn't exist there. Time is here because of us, and we're here because of time. Oh, I should have done more. Looks at his hands, I could have been another Jimmy Page. He's referring to his skill as a guitarist. I could have done more. Me, but you were the greatest dad, and Dad, smirking a little to indicate that isn't what he meant. Do more. Do everything you can. Me. So, like carpe diem? Like seize the day? Dad brightens. Yes, do everything you can. Don't worry about the consequences. Everyone finds their way. People worry too much about the consequences. Just do good and do as much as you can. Everyone eventually gets there. Tell the family. Me. Can I tell everyone? Dad. Yes, tell everyone. Me. Okay, Dad. I'll tell everybody. Dad nods in agreement. I can tell he's tired by this time. Me. I love you, Dad. Dad. I love you too, son. This was the last conversation that I had with him. I miss him terribly, and have been trying real hard to find myself again after his passing. It's been a long time, and I've been able to cope with it enough to finally write this all out. I hope this finds someone that needs to hear it. Story 27. Not necessarily clinically dead, but I was pronounced dead 2 times in the same night after a car accident I was in when I was 16. My great-grandma pulled me out of the car, and we walked through this really peaceful field of flowers. When I woke up 2 weeks later, she was sitting on the edge of my bed and told me to tell my mom that everything was going to be okay. My great-grandma died when I was 10, and before that, she had been bedridden after a stroke. I never saw her walk or heard her talk in my entire life. It was amazing and beautiful. Story 28. My mother experienced a long corridor with arched doorways. One was open, and she said she refused to go in. She suffered a massive stroke at 27 from a spinal tap done a week earlier. Story 29. I don't share it much, but I've had 4 heart surgeries. And in my first and third one, I coded. You had to be conscious for these surgeries to get your heart to react appropriately. The first time, it was just nothingness. Black. Just nothing. I can't even explain how long it felt like nothingness. And then I remember waking up with them over me saying, "We lost you for a second there. Are you okay?" The second time is the hard one to share. I woke up in a type of subway feeling thing, but everything was white. The subway, the tunnel walls we were speeding through. I didn't have a body per se. It felt like I was the subway at times, and at times it was like I was just looking out a window at the tunnel wall. It came to a stop, and it was just black nothingness again. And then I heard a voice of a much older man. He said, "Are you ready to go?" And I just had nothing, like I didn't know how to speak. "We're going now if you're ready." And something inside me felt so ready to go, like I was a magnet to it, this unknown destination in the black nothingness ahead. I remember finally saying, "Oh, okay," he said another time with a slightly different tone. "We'll be leaving here. You are ready to go?" And finally something in me snapped, and I remembered I had a life, and people I'd leave behind. And my first thought was, I can't leave my girlfriend. I couldn't do that. And my mom and dad, my puppies. I can't leave any of them, my family, my friends. And I made a decision I couldn't leave. I didn't even have to say it. Once I decided I couldn't leave, and I was for sure staying, I woke up and came to consciousness with the medical team all around me. Story 30. I think about death a lot, like an insane, worrying amount. I cry about it a lot too. I'm terrified to die. I'm terrified of what comes after, and I'm terrified of losing people I love. This thread has actually made me feel a bit better about it. So, thank you, Op. I lost my mom last year, and I remember her telling me when I was little, because I would say it first, that she was scared to die. I'm glad to know that it isn't as bad as we both thought. Story 31. I don't know if this counts, as I don't think I flatlined, but I had a huge postpartum after my second and last child was born. I lost 2.3 LTRs of blood, which I think is about half of all my blood, and considered the highest classification of blood loss before death occurs. I was given general anesthetic before I passed out on my own, but leading up to that was such a surreal experience. As someone has previously mentioned, there is this sense of acceptance, of laying back and going with it. When I first started bleeding, I was scared and panicking. By the time I was being wheeled into theater, I was smiling at the midwife and telling her it was going to be okay. I was delirious and euphoric and not scared at all. My vision started to go. At first, it was colored spots. Then everything had a gray hue as tunnel vision set in. Sound became muffled, like putting my hands over my ears. The whole time, the general feeling of indifference and no urge to fight it was there. It was so calm, I don't think I've ever computed just how lucky I am to be here. So a near-death experience by blood loss can confirm, not bad. The recovery, though, I felt like crap for ducking weeks and had PSD. I was so physically weak that I could barely take care of the baby and had to inject myself with anti-clotting meds for 6 weeks every day. Story 32. There are some researchers who have been collecting and quantifying the data of near-death experiences, NDEs, for years now. They have created 6 categories, stages of NDEs that generally sum up most experiences. 1. The hellish experience. It can be either a mildly uncomfortable experience, a cold, dark, damp, loveless experience, or the traditional flames and devil experience. Sometimes say they are drawn out of this realm by an indescribable love. Very few people recount experiencing this. 2. There is another type of experience where one has an out-of-body perspective and can travel freely. Oftentimes, this happens in an operation room where one's heart has stopped and the doctors are working to revive the patient. The individual may be able to go to other rooms in the hospital or travel across the country. If they remain in the hospital room, they do not always recognize their own bodies on the table and can feel confused. Quick note, there have been a surge in NDEs since the 1960s, when resuscitation techniques became more advanced. 3. Much like many of the other Redditors' comments, there is another experience of blissful, warm darkness that just feels comfortable. It is indescribable nothingness, often without memory or any inkling of consciousness at all. 4. The next experience is similar to the last, but with an additional light that is usually far away, that emanates warmth and love and forgiveness. The individual is either attracted to this light and goes toward it, or the light itself comes to the person. It allegedly gets better and better the closer one draws to the light, and so they continue. Obviously, this is where the phrase, don't go to the light, likely comes from. 5. This experience continues where the last leaves off, where the person has broken through the light to the other side. They now are experiencing a love/compassion/forgiveness/state of consciousness that is unlike anything they can put into words. Sometimes they encounter a sort of guide. This could be a loving anonymous being or a religious figure. If they experience this, it is sometimes linked to their beliefs on Earth, but not always. This experience is sometimes accompanied by the most beautiful music. This being may present them to loved ones or show them a life review. This is a very common experience of those who have had NDEs. It may be at this point where the endeared decides or is told to return to their body. There is sometimes a choice, because they have work left to accomplish in their lives. And I put that last part in quotes because of how many people cite that as their reasons on coming back. 6. The final experience goes beyond the previous state of love and consciousness and is experienced only by a relatively few people compared to the previous others. They say that they experience a becoming one with the universal energy that unites everything God. They have stated that they understand everything, that knowledge is known just by thinking of a topic. Disclaimer, people have different words to describe all these experiences, but what they typically agree on is that words themselves cannot come close to explaining their encounter for all of the aforementioned NDEs. Most experiences are overwhelmingly pleasant. They lose fear of death, and they cannot wait to return to this state. However, they know they must wait. The NDEs that I've looked into pretty much all fall into these categories, so I'd like to hear any others that might not. As you can tell, this interests me greatly. I want to end this by saying that if you wind up researching NDEs, come to your own conclusions about them. Is there a reason for someone to be pushing a certain belief on you? I have confidence that what people say about their NDEs, they themselves wholly believe to be true. Whether or not you do is up to your own judgment. There are people who make videos and give talks about NDEs they supposedly experience. But to me, some seem to be fake and over-rehearsed. Take what you want from my spiel, and if you have any questions about this, I've done a fair share of looking into the topic and would love to discuss further. If you want any directions on where to look first into gaining your own knowledge of NDEs, I can definitely help you find something. Your ND plug, out. Story 33, not me. But right before my great-grandma passed, she kept trying to explain these vivid colors and smells. She kept saying how beautiful things were, and she was saying it's unlike anything she ever saw. She was an extremely religious woman. A little while after the colors and smells, she told us, he said we have to say it's okay for her to go. I mean, my whole family was standing around saying goodbye. I vividly remember this, even though I was only 9. Once we all said it was okay, she passed on. Also, the night before, she was talking to herself. We asked her, what's going on? And she pointed at the chair across the room and said, please don't be rude. I'm having a conversation with her. And we were confused and asked about what, and she said, the woman was explaining what we were going to do with our futures. So strange, and I'll never know if it was real or what was happening, but it's kind of cool to think it's real. Story 34. So this is secondhand from my dad, but he was always a little shaken up when he told this story. Years before I came along, my dad was cruising around on his motorcycle when a little dog ran into the road straight at him barking. He swerved so he wouldn't hit the poor pupper, and a car in opposing traffic did as well. My dad got clipped and thrown off his bike. It was on a hill, so he slid pretty far until his body hit a parked car. Now the weird part, he always got this sort of haunted look when he talked about it, which wasn't very often. He says he remembers plain as day, standing at the bottom of the street on the corner watching as a man got hit off his bike and tumbled through the air and down the hill. He says he remembers thinking, that guy is definitely going to die. He woke up the next day in the hospital with a nurse picking gravel out of his back. He had reconstruction surgery on his hand and arm, which consists mostly of metal pins now. Remember, kids, if on a motorcycle, always wear your leathers and helmet. Without them, my dad would have died and I wouldn't be around. And I. Story 35. When I was a really young kid, I had a serious case of epiglottitis, which left me clinically dead for a moment. It felt like a dream where I was in the sky, kind of like an angel looking down at myself in the hospital with doctors and nurses surrounding me, my mother crying. I didn't seem to care very much, but I remember thinking that I want to go back. I was very young, maybe 3, but I still remember this quite vividly. It seemed like an out-of-body experience. For sure, this was influenced by the fact that my parents are Catholic, and I enjoyed looking at cupids in paintings, because they looked a bit like me when I was young. That's at least what I tell myself. Story 36. Overdosed on caffeine, have a weak heartbeat. Before it actually happened, I was hallucinating, dreaming, and couldn't see clearly. All my fear faded away in an instant. Then crap all just went black, and it felt like I was asleep, but I didn't remember when I actually fell down and blacked out. Woke up when my heart restarted wanting to stay in that sleepy state. Story 37. I have 2 stories. When I was 9, I used to have fainting spells. One time I fell down the stairs and lost consciousness. My mom said I went as stiff as a board. I remember as if floating near the ceiling, watching my mom run to the phone and calling 911. I could see my dad start to do CPR on me. Then I looked behind me and saw a bright light and heard a voice say, "It's not your time." Then I went back into my body as I heard my dad yell, "Come on, damn it." I was really scared when I came to, and it took me a while, like years, to figure out what I had experienced. I can't explain what happened. I felt calm, though, while I was out. I don't know if I was really dead or just unconscious, and my mind made it all up. The other story I know was real. 6 years ago, my brother died from adrenal terminal illness. His wife and I slept in his hospital room that night. His friends and the two of us sat around his bed as he lay unconscious and told stories about my brother and laughed about all the great times we had with him. At 3 a.m., I woke from a dream I was having of seeing him walking down a large tunnel that had a bright light at the end of it. He was healthy looking again, and he turned around to look at me, smiled and waved, then walked into the light. When I woke up, I rolled over to look at him. He had stopped breathing. I touched him, and he was still warm, and his skin was still soft, as if he had just passed away a moment before. It was like he hung on until he knew we would be okay, and then waited to pass until we were sleeping, so we didn't have to watch him take his last breaths. I loved my brother. He was my best friend, my biggest champion, and he encouraged me and built me up when I had no confidence in myself. I miss him, but I'm relieved that he's not in pain and suffering anymore. Story 38. I'm not sure if I was clinically dead or not, but I drowned in the ocean 4 years ago, saving 2 children who had been swept out to sea by a freak landslip and subsequent strong current. I don't really remember my last action before drowning, but the lifeboat crew said they saw me, and before going under, I threw the children to them. They said the only explanation is a rush of adrenaline at the sight of them arriving and knowing help had arrived, as there should have been no way I could have thrown 2 kids in that situation. To be perfectly honest, I'd given up hope as I felt my energy sapping trying to keep the children above the water as all 3 of us were clothed, and I felt the lactic acid building up and try as I may. I couldn't move my limbs anymore. I was just telling the children it was going to be okay, knowing full well I was about to run out of steam any moment. The relief of getting to them was swiftly replaced by dread, as I turned and realized how far we were from the beach, and the terrifying realization of how fatigued I was set in and thinking that there was no way we were going to survive. After I threw both children to the crew who had arrived at speed with rescue gear, they said I went under. Only by sheer luck did they manage to pull me out of the water too and revive me. I remember clearly not being able to see when I went under the waves and beneath the ocean, and as I started to breathe in the water. Instead of fear, I felt strong sadness at not knowing if I had done enough to save them. A couple of gulps later, I must have gone unconscious, as the next thing I remember is being revived by CPR, apparently, and coming round. It was very confusing, and I haven't really talked about it until now, but the one thing that is deeply strange to me is that there was no fear at the point of drowning, only calm and the wish that I knew that the children had made it and they were safe. Very strange. The children are 11 and 8 now and living happy lives, thank goodness. It could have been so very different, and I don't take life for granted, that's for sure. Every day is a gift. Story 39. I am 18 hours too late for this, but I still want to write on here. My brother passed away 4 months ago. We still don't know how it happened or what the cause of death was. He died on the same day Avishai died. The next day, we were able to know how he died, but it's been past 4 months since my little brother passed, and we are still in the dark with his death. The absence of pain, the release, the feeling of nothing, and not being afraid of nothing. Acceptance. Thank you. The day I saw my brother laying on the floor of his downstairs bathroom is still extremely vivid in my mind. His feet were pointed towards the door, his head on the ground near the washing machine, and a small pile of vomit still attached to his mouth. His legs were crossed as if he laid down. He had ordered pizza from our local pizza joint in town. The receipt and box was still in the living room. It was almost like he was just going to the bathroom. The first thing that jumped in my head was, I hope this wasn't painful, and the second part was months and months of true sadness. The night my brother died, his daughter saw him. She said he told her that Dada loves you and to be strong. I miss him every single day. His daughter, who is turning 4 today, told my wife and I am broken. I have no Dada. I am broken. I am glad that he has no pain wherever he is now, but I'm pissed that he would leave all of us so soon to deal with all this pain. I had a dream with him in it last night. It was very vivid. He was wearing a red shirt and he sat on the edge of my bed. I was just crying, and I leaned in and gave him a huge hug, and he returned the hug. He smelled clean like clothes right after being in the wash. Then he stood and started eating McDonald's. He said he didn't have to care about his cholesterol here, and he could eat whatever he wanted to. Then I woke up. Story 40. My grandmother, when she was a kid, was walking her dog when she got hit by a car. She and her dog hit a fire hydrant, and at that instant, she rose up from the city block she was at with her dog. The dog survived. She reached the top of somewhere, and a voice told her, "Look at your mother, who was crying. You can't go, and you have a lot to do." So she came to in the hospital and tried to close her eyes and go back and was crying because it was so peaceful. Story 41. Okay, so this will get buried for sure. But here we go. When I was 15, I was dead for a short while during an ambulance ride. I have no idea how long it was, TBH. My therapist after suggested I find out the details to know how close I came to permanent death, but that's too much for me. Anyways, on to my experience. I was in so much pain and anxiety leading up to it. You have no idea. I wanted it to end. And then everything faded away. First to black, and then to something I can only describe as seeing and feeling existence itself. I don't even know how to describe this. It's the only way I can describe what it was because it was so beyond normal perception. Mind you, I'm not a religious person, so that was definitely strange. All my pain was gone and I felt great, like I was getting a warm hug from the universe, and everything was truly awesome. Coming back was fairly sudden, first hearing voices and then a fading back into where I was. This was definitely the most unpleasant part. The closest thing I can compare the fading in out to visually would be when a movie does a slow fade between scenes. And the feeling is similar to laying down in bed, that last second before you fall asleep and are totally relaxed and not thinking, just experiencing your being. All this said, I fear death more than anything else. Yes, it was pleasant, but I never want to have that experience again. I'm actually on the verge of tears just thinking about it right now. Maybe it's my atheism showing, but death as a permanent thing just terrifies me. Story 42. I don't know if this counts, but I had surgery on my hip back in February '09 because I'd been in a car accident. When I was coming out of surgery, it was discovered that I'd been slightly overdosed on anesthetic, never found out by how much though. Instead of the typical amount of time spent in the recovery room, I think I spent a solid 2.5 hours in there. I kept falling asleep and ceasing to breathe every 60 seconds for over an hour. Every time I faded out, everything simply went black. I felt nothing. I saw nothing. But there was no fear, no pain. I do remember feeling incredibly calm, and like I was being torn between two completely different dimensions every time I alternated between being conscious and slipping away. Interestingly, it was my mother yelling at me to breathe every time I faded out that kept me waking back up. It was a really strange experience. I don't know if I was clinically dead because it was for such short periods of time, but it definitely made me less afraid of dying. I'm sure this will sound insane to some, but I'm pretty convinced that there is a lot we don't know about the universe, and I believe that our consciousnesses are a part of it. I believe quite firmly that when we die, we don't cease to exist, because we've always been here and we always will be, just like everything that is, just in a different form. Like how, at one point, everything that exists now was once a simple collection of hydrogen atoms. The universe just had to take a lot of time to develop what would become consciousness and bodies to house it, so that it could finally observe itself. But bodies don't last forever, and we should all feel incredibly lucky to have been given the chance to be a part of existence that was alive and self-aware. I know I do. Story 43. True story. I had a clinical chief, senior surgeon, during training always asked the same question after a heroic resuscitation that involved open heart massage to regain a beat in the trauma bay, aka a left lateral thoracotomy. Hospitals were different then. Large wards with 6 patients that we would round on with medical students, residents, fellows, and attending, maybe 20 people. So he would ask, "Do you remember anything?" And the gangbangers would inevitably say it was a scary experience and they were frightened by demons or some nightmare scenario. And the victim of a random act of violence during a mugging would say, "I saw a white light. It wasn't scary," or "It was beautiful." I'm not particularly religious and reasoned this away as the mental state of the victim, but it would give me chills to hear some of the answers. Story 44. Coded after attempting died with Ativan, which is stupid. My son had passed away 3 years before, and I remember going to a place without time and watching him grow up without the neonatal Marfan syndrome and hydrocephalus that killed him. I should point out that I lost consciousness before code was called, so I don't remember rising out of my body. I do remember slamming back into it after being shocked, though. That was no fun. My life changed completely afterwards. I left my wife, who wasn't helping me in my own struggles with Marfan syndrome, got the guts to come out as trans, and found a great woman who supports me and is totally in love with me. I don't worry about anything but love, and taking care of the people around me. Life is too short for anything else. A visit with my son sorted it all out. Story 45. This actually happened to me Monday. Tuesday morning, actually. Was going through a lot of money issues and thought I was going to lose everything. Died in the closet. Fiancé found me, cut me down, called 911. I was blue, dead in her arms, and I pissed in my pants. Tongue is still swollen, have no idea how that happened. The EMTs brought me back. I was dead and they brought me back. I'm still at the hospital now and don't see me leaving anytime soon. Anyway, I saw nothing. Just darkness. No sounds. No white light. Nothing. Black. Next thing I know, I woke up in an ambulance. Died sucks, guys, don't even try it. People love you. Story 46. My father died on the table for 2 minutes. He tells me that he ended up on a beach and his grandfather was there, and they sat and talked for a while. Then he came back. Story 47. I overdosed twice. I've been clean for 6 years now. The first time, I felt nothing at first. I just remember falling down. I was by myself in my room and my brother was in the living room. He had no idea. I couldn't really move and I tried to text my mom, whom was luckily on her way home from work. Text didn't make sense. So the first thing she did when she got home was find me. I don't remember. But the next thing I do remember is feeling like lava was being injected into my brain and like I just wanted to get up and go. No light flashing before my eyes, nothing like that. Just lava in the brain. The second time I had no idea it even happened, but my best friend saved my life. I know it's kind of morbid, but that's definitely the way I'd be down to go out. It was just like I fell asleep. I'm glad I didn't die though. I never thought things could get as good as they are if I just used my head and did what I knew I was supposed to. Got help, got clean, getting married. Edit. To brighten up the subject in a sick way, we have an inside joke between myself, fiance, best friend, and my recently deceased other best friend. We yell, "Get the shot!" because the whole ordeal was similar to the scene in Pulp Fiction where Uma Thurman overdosed and John Travolta revived her with the adrenaline shot. Kind of funny in a sick way. Story 48. My dad clinically died for over a minute as a result of an iodine drip during a procedure, despite a documented severe iodine allergy. He described it as an out-of-body experience in which there was complete silence and he was the spectator in the upper corner of the room, watching the staff scramble to revive him. He said he had no concept of time or of the panic below. He just observed in total peace. He saw one nurse, finally, notice his bracelet and alert everyone of what the issue was. They cut the drip and continued their efforts to revive him. During this time, even though he was watching the end of his life, he felt an extreme peace and was pain-free for the first time in years. He was aware that he was dying, and he was ready and content. Everything got bright, and he started to float upwards until he saw a man that he didn't recognize who told him it wasn't his time yet. All at once, he was jolted back into his body and came to. Once stable, he described what he witnessed and even thanked the particular nurse that noticed his allergy alert bracelet. They were all baffled that he knew such detail. I can only hope that when he did pass away 4 years ago, it was an even more peaceful experience than this. It gives me peace. Knowing death was something that he had faced already, so he wasn't scared of it when it came again. Story 49? I had a similar experience. Remember medics banging on my chest telling me not to give up. I remember hearing everything everyone was saying. I even remember thinking, dude, stop hitting my chest. I remember being put in the ambulance and being in the emergency room. When I told my mom later that I heard all of them and remember everything, she told me there was no way I could have because I was completely unresponsive when they found me. It definitely had a profound effect on me. It's made me actually more afraid of death because I personally believe your brain lives long after your body stops, which is extremely terrifying. Story 50. Not me, but my late grandfather was clinically dead in the hospital's ICU after surgery many years ago, around 1990. I don't remember what surgery he had, but he was in his 80s and had a host of illnesses at that point. Diabetes, he broke his hip, etc. This particular night in the ICU, he coded, they brought him back. And when he woke up, he asked a nurse, "How's the little boy doing?" She said, "What little boy?" "The boy with the gunshot wounds. How is he?" The nurse replied, "Oh, he's going to be okay." He asked other questions about patients who had been brought into the ER at the exact time he was clinically dead and on a different floor of the hospital. They asked how he knew about those ER patients, and he said he was floating, and he saw them. He saw them working on himself, and floated to the ER and saw those patients. There were multiple witnesses, hospital employees at the time to corroborate this. I remember being silently amazed at their lack of astonishment to his experience. Seems like this wasn't the first time this happened to a patient. Story 51. I nearly drowned in the ocean as a kid. A lifeguard on his very first day of training saw me thrashing from 1/4 mile away and was able to get to me after I had filled my lungs with sailor and sank. I do remember him gripping my arm before completely blacking out. Drowning BTTW is a very comfy way to go. After the struggle and convulsive intake of water, there is a warm serenity. With my heart and lungs stopped, I was pronounced dead on the beach by trained lifeguards. But they kept up the CPR until the paramedics came and shocked me back to life. To this day, I remember everything, both physically and mentally, about the incident vividly. Way clearer than any other childhood memory. But the period I was pronounced to be dead was a black hole of non-conscious nothingness. So this is kind of interesting. The scariest thing during the whole incident was after I was shocked back to life and was too weak to move. I could feel the paramedic undoing the drawstring of my shorts. "He's going to show everyone my pee-pee," my feeble brain registered before I once again blacked out. Story 52. Not me, but my mom. She had gotten an ulcer back in 2008. When she got to the hospital, she said there was a male doctor that told her she needed surgery immediately or she would die. She said that during this time, she was fighting and thrashing and screaming because my father had just abandoned us and she was desperately trying to get back to us. She said the male doctor told her everything was going to be okay and that we were safe and sound after her experience. She checked out of the hospital and a couple of weeks later turned up at the same hospital with a cake and card, hoping to find the male doctor that took care of her. When she got there, she described him, and the woman at the help desk was confused. There had been no male doctor that day, or any day. All the staff were females. The said man never even worked there. A lot of time has passed, but I always like to think an angel watched over my mom that night, and that helped my mom get back to my family. Story 53. I'm probably too late to this thread, but I have an interesting story, so I'll share it. I was not the one who experienced this, but it was one of my teachers I had in high school a few years ago. She was having open heart surgery in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and coded 3 times during the surgery. When she came out of surgery and began to regain consciousness, she kept speaking of all these souls that she saw. I remember her saying she was scared for them and wasn't sure what would happen to them. I can't remember exactly what she said about the souls, but I do remember her saying that they had all just died in an accident. Her surgery was on August 1st, 2007. This was also the day that the I-35W bridge collapsed in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the same city she was in. It collapsed while she was being operated on. Story 54. I wasn't dead, but I was dying. I passed out on the floor on my back and puked while on the ground. I remember being surrounded by nothingness. Then all of a sudden, this loud, terrible static that overwhelmed me completely. Everything started beating, and in retrospect, this was my heartbeat. Suddenly, the static and noise began fading inwards until it became a small speck, and I felt air rushing into me. My vision came back, and an EMT was bagging me. I felt terribly weak and groggy, but all there. All in all, terrible experience. I think it was me coming back to life. IDK. Story 55. This gets kind of graphic, so be warned. I was abused by a guy I don't know. What's worse was that it was pretty hard. I remember the moment where the pain was too much to handle. He was chalking me, and after what was 80 seconds, I counted. I just stopped. I felt my heart stop. Everything faded, and I was in this awkward phase where it felt like I was being pulled out of my body. He got scared and started hitting my chest really hard. I felt like I was watching it happen, the panic in his eyes, but I felt nothing physically. I just watched, emotionless. After what I'm sure was seconds but felt timeless, I felt like I was sucked back into reality. My head hurt really badly, and he just got more angry when I started responding. I spent the rest of the trying to comprehend it. Story 56? Not me, but my grandfather. Went into surgery for a triple bypass, and his vitals tanked. He said during it, he suddenly was laying in his bed at home. His friends and family members who had passed away in the past were waving him over and saying to come home. He told them not yet, and then went back. Story 57. Never been dead. Just been around hundreds of people before death, and almost 100% of those people were the most at peace with it. The family is never ready, but the person is. It's eerily beautiful how many people have told me it's okay, they're ready to die. Story 58. I was hit by a car while riding a bicycle without a helmet when I was 18. I suffered a traumatic brain injury which led to a condition called status epilepticus. Not dead, but close. My heart worked, but I was without oxygen for a long time. I woke up in the hospital nearly 2 weeks later in severe pain. I had one hell of a headache. I had a weird recollection of a dreamlike state where I dreamed in 8-bit, kind of like Mario, except it was a field of flowers and a bunny rabbit. It was quiet. I felt nothing. I was riding my bike 1 minute and completely gone the next. It was a traumatic event I still have issues with nearly 15 years later. Story 59. Long story short, I had a bad reaction to a bunch of medication after a C-section and died for a short period of time. I never got to hold my son. I remember hearing people talking calmly but stern and a lot of beeping. Then it was quite a bit like others described, calm, black, and then just nothing. I heard someone, probably a nurse, say that it was time to be a mommy and meet my boy. I faded in and out until eventually I woke up. It sounds cheesy, but if it wasn't for my son, I probably would have never come back. Story 60 was firefighter. My life flashed before my eyes. Like remembering a dream a lot all at once. Find a happy life. Every experience you experienced is recorded in your brain in scary detail. If that went on forever, you will want to live a better life. Story 61. Before we met, my now wife went into septic shock, died for a couple of minutes. She told me that all she saw was darkness. She felt nothing, but she did hear someone saying her son's name, and she felt herself float towards the voice and then woke up in the ICU. Story 62. I wasn't clinically dead, is that possible to survive? But I experienced something that I can never fully describe. It was kind of like being in a room alone, but then you somehow sense that someone else is there, that someone else was an energy, pure good energy. It was a humbling experience. Can't write much now, but maybe later I'll try to explain further. Story 63. People who say they were aware of everything but can't move is my nightmare. It's one of the reasons why I want to be cremated. Can't stand the thought of being trapped in my own dead body forever. Story 64. My mother died 3 times during a year-long hospital stay in the mid-68s. She was hit by a drunk driver. The shortest time was 7 minutes. The longest was 12 minutes. Docs told my grandmother to make funeral arrangements, that she wouldn't be going home. She was 18. During 12-minute death, she felt euphoria, was aware of people around her, but says some people she was aware of were people that had died before her, like her father.